Oftentimes, when people hear the word miracle, they imagine God bypassing the natural world. That's especially true oftentimes with Exodus, because Exodus really is one of the most bombastic events in the entire biblical account. Because it's larger than life, oftentimes we think of God stepping in and nature stopping, the laws of creation suspending. God steps in from the outside to perform the miraculous. But what if that's not the only way that scripture presents the miraculous? In the Exodus, God does not rescue Israel by avoiding nature. He rescues Israel by using nature. Before we get into it, my name is Joe Day, and I am a pastor and Bible teacher. And if you enjoy biblical deep dives into biblical archaeology and history and demystifying matters of the faith, then go ahead and subscribe, like the video, and if this channel blesses you, share it with a friend. The reality is, the Exodus in the ancient Near East is one of the most scientifically rich stories from the Bible. You just have to know where to look. In the Exodus, God rescues Israel using the natural order that he created. He uses the Nile, the ecosystem around the Nile, animals, insects, disease, weather, ash, gas, wind, and water. That's the basic model. The Exodus is not nature instead of God. It is nature under God. The creator uses the creation. There is no tension to be had, because if we understand that the Exodus event actually happened, then why wouldn't God use what he created to save his people? So the question is not, can science explain God away? That is half-hearted and sloppy. The better question is, what natural processes could God have used, and how do these processes fit the sequence of the Exodus? Because the order of the plagues matters. The Nile is struck first, then the fish die, then the frogs leave the water, then the insects multiply, then disease spreads, then livestock dies, then boils break out, then the sky becomes violent, then locusts consume what remains, then darkness covers the land, then death comes in the night, and then wind drives back the sea. These aren't random. This is a chain. The most coherent scientific reconstruction is that this is a cascading natural disaster event. Now, you may have heard that this was a theological and divine attack against the systems of Egypt, the systems of worship, the systems of power, and all of that has 2 legs and 10 toes to stand on. I believe there's real teeth to the idea that there are specific worship, specific divine systems around the pain points of what is attacked within the Exodus system. I also understand that at this time, there are very real implications to the physical events that are taking place. And friends, more than one thing can be true at the same time. Just because this has a deeper spiritual and theological level to it doesn't negate the very real and tangible aspects of what happened. A collapse in the Nile system begins the first movement of what's taking place. That collapse creates ecological consequences. Those consequences create insect and disease conditions. Then a major atmospheric disturbance explains the sky plagues. Then a gas event gives a physical category for sudden night death. Then wind setdown explains how a body of water could be driven back long enough for Israel to cross. That doesn't remove God from the story. It explains the natural means that God may have used. And that distinction matters because science can explain and describe mechanism. Theology explains the meaning. In Exodus, the mechanisms are water, ecology, disease, atmosphere, gas, wind, and the body of water. The meaning is deliverance for his people. The meaning is the same motif and pattern that we see repeated throughout the entirety of Scripture because it's the backbone of God's story with his people. God uses the created world to set slaves free. Before we walk through the plagues, we need to locate the story in a physical world. The Exodus is tied to Egypt. It's tied to the eastern Nile Delta. It's tied to Semitic populations in Egypt. It's tied to labor, movement, desert routes, and Egyptian control. Avaris is important here. Avaris was a major site in the eastern delta with strong evidence of Semitic presence. That matters because an Exodus style event requires Semitic people living in Egypt. It's literally what we're talking about. In a region where departure into the wilderness and movement towards Sinai makes geographical sense. Now, that doesn't prove every detail of the Exodus by itself, but it gives us a real setting. Semitic people in Egypt is not imaginary. The Eastern Delta isn't imaginary. The world required by the story is not impossible. Now, there's also evidence of Semitic speaking laborers connected to Egyptian controlled mining regions in Sinai. Early alphabetic inscriptions from those contexts point to Semitic workers operating within Egyptian systems of extraction and labor. That matters because Exodus is a story about oppressed labor, Egyptian power, movement through wilderness regions, and the world between Egypt and Sinai. So the background isn't vague here. We have a plausible world, Semitic populations in Egypt, a delta setting, Egyptian labor systems, movement toward Sinai. And then we have Egyptian memory of catastrophe. The Ahmose Tempest Stela is significant because it preserves Egyptian language of violent natural disruption, storm, darkness, destruction, and disorder. Sound familiar? It doesn't need to be treated as a one-to-one record of the Exodus plagues in order for it to matter. Its importance is that Egypt itself remembered catastrophic conditions in language that overlaps with the kind of natural phenomenon that Exodus describes: storm, darkness, damage, disorder. So when we talk about the plagues scientifically, we're not discussing abstract ideas here. We're talking about phenomena that belong to the real environment and memory world of ancient Egypt. Now we can move into the plague sequence itself. The first scientific claim is that the Nile begins the cascade. The Nile was Egypt's life support system. It was the source of drinking water. It sustained agriculture. It irrigated the fields. It supported fishing. It allowed transportation. It shaped the economy. It carried religious meaning. If the Nile failed, then Egypt shuddered. So when Exodus says that the Nile turned to blood, the most important scientific point is not simply the color. The point is that the water system became unlivable. The water becomes red or blood-like. The water becomes toxic. The fish die. The river stinks. People cannot drink from it. That is a water system collapse. There are several natural processes that can turn water red and make it deadly. A toxic algae bloom can discolor water, reduce oxygen levels, and kill aquatic life. A major sediment disturbance can bring iron-rich material into oxygenated water, producing a reddish appearance. Seismic activity can disturb the riverbed or nearby water systems. Gas release or chemical disturbance can change water chemistry very quickly. The exact trigger is still debated, but the effect is what matters for the sequence. The Nile becomes hostile to life. Fish die first because fish are trapped inside the contaminated water. Now that leads directly to the second plague: frogs. Frogs are amphibians. They live in and around water, but unlike fish, they can leave the water. So if the Nile becomes toxic, fish die in the river, but frogs flee from the water. That explains why frogs appear throughout the land. They're displaced. They're trying to escape a poisoned water system. So they move into homes, sleeping areas, ovens, and food preparation spaces because the environment that they normally inhabit has become unlivable. Then the frogs die. Now, Egypt has two problems: dead fish in the water and dead frogs on the land. Now, that creates a widespread sanitation crisis. Rotting fish contaminate the water, rotting frogs contaminate the ground. Food spaces are polluted. The smell becomes overwhelming. Clean water is harder to access. Disease risk increases. This leads to the next stage: insects. Gnats and flies fit naturally after dead organic matter begins accumulating. Insects thrive around rot, waste, carcasses, stagnant water, contaminated water, and unclean living conditions. So the third and fourth plagues are not disconnected events. They are the ecological result of the first two plagues. Again, the water system collapses. Then animals die. Then organic matter rots. And then insects multiply. And insects are not merely irritating, they are disease vectors. They move between carcasses, waste, food, animals, people. They bite, they contaminate surfaces, and they spread bacteria. They turn environmental collapse into biological sickness. That explains the next plague: livestock disease. Livestock would be extremely vulnerable in this environment. They drink from compromised water sources. They graze in contaminated fields. They're bitten by insects. They're weakened by stress and poor conditions. Disease spreads quickly through herds when the environment breaks down. So the livestock plague follows the insect plague naturally. Then comes the boils. Boils also fit this chain of events. See, when the water is contaminated, sanitation collapses, insects multiply, and disease spreads. Skin infections become more likely. Boils can be caused by bacterial infection. They can be worsened by insect bites, contaminated living conditions, poor hygiene, and weakened immune systems. So the first six plagues work as a connected ecological sequence. Water contamination leads to fish dying. That leads to frog displacement and eventually frog death. That leads to rotting organic matter, which leads to insect multiplication and then disease transmission, which leads to livestock death and human skin infection. That's the first major scientific foundation of the Exodus model. The early plagues are not six unrelated supernatural events as they are sometimes presented. They are a Nile based ecological cascade. God strikes the life source of Egypt, and the consequences move through the ecosystem. That's how nature works. A river does not fail alone. When the water system fails, the effects move outward into animals, insects, disease, food, and human bodies. Now, the model shifts from the Nile to the atmosphere, and that's where Santorini becomes incredibly important. Santorini, also known as Thera, was one of the major volcanic eruptions of the ancient Mediterranean world. A volcanic event of that scale can affect regions far beyond the island itself. A major eruption can inject ash and gas, pulverized rock, sulfur compounds, water vapor, and heat into the atmosphere. That would affect visibility. That would disturb weather patterns. That would produce lightning inside the volcanic plume. It can produce ashfall. It can contribute to the darkness, and it can damage crops. It can disrupt regional conditions. That gives us a physical framework for the sky plagues. The seventh plague is hail, but Exodus doesn't describe normal hail here. It describes thunder, hail, and fire flashing in the middle of the hail. Now, that's unusual language. From a volcanic atmospheric perspective, it does make sense. Inside an eruption plume, ash particles collide with each other. Those collisions create electrical charge. That charge can produce volcanic lightning. So fire flashing in the sky can correspond with lightning inside an ash-filled atmospheric event. There's also the issue of falling material. Volcanic ash can clump together with moisture and fall into pellets or aggregates. Hard falling material combined with lightning and storm conditions could be described by ancient observers as hail and fire together. So the seventh plague can be understood as severe atmospheric fallout, not ordinary weather, atmospheric disruption, falling material, lightning, and crop damage. That leads naturally into the eighth plague, which is locusts. Locust behavior is strongly affected by environmental conditions. Rainfall, wind, temperature, vegetation, and regional ecological stress all matter. If hail or falling material damages crops and vegetation, and if weather systems are disturbed, then locust swarms can become the next stage of agricultural collapse. In Exodus, the locusts come after the hail, after it damages the crops. Then the locusts consume what remains, which, side note, does correspond with a wood shortage from Egyptian history. So the agricultural sequence remains coherent. The sky event wounds Egypt's food supply. The locusts finish off the job. Then comes the darkness. This is one of the strongest places where a volcanic atmospheric model helps explain the text. Exodus says the darkness could be felt. Now, that phrase matters because ordinary darkness is seen. This darkness is felt. That suggests something physical in the air. Ash gives that phrase scientific weight, not just metaphoric. Volcanic ash is not soft like fireplace ash. It's tiny particles of pulverized rock and glass. It can hang in the air. It can block sunlight. It can reduce visibility. It can irritate the eyes, throat, lungs, and skin. It can settle on surfaces and make breathing difficult. It can make the air feel heavy. So a darkness that could be felt is not simply nighttime. It's particle-filled darkness. It's ash darkness. It's air that has become physically oppressive. That makes sense with the biblical description. The darkness is not only the absence of light, it is the presence of material in the atmosphere. So Santorini provides a major scientific anchor for the middle and later plagues. It gives a mechanism for atmospheric disturbance. It helps explain hail and fire. It helps explain crop damage. It helps explain conditions that could contribute to locust movement. It helps explain felt darkness. The point is not that every detail of timing is settled beyond dispute. That's not what this account of history is giving us. The point is that the mechanism is real and coherent. We do not need to pull random thoughts and events together in order to get to a point where this is a viable explanation of what's happening under the hood. A major volcanic event can affect the sky, weather, light, crops, and air quality across a wide region. So that's when we come to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Now, this is the hardest plague to model scientifically because the text is very specific. It's not simply mass death, it's death of the firstborn. A natural model, often connected to this plague, is a low-lying gas event. The clearest modern anchor is Lake Nyos in Cameroon. In 1986, Lake Nyos released a massive cloud of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is heavier than normal air. When released in large quantities, it can remain close to the ground, flow outward, displace oxygen, and suffocate people and animals. The people who died did not die from wounds. They died because breathable air had been displaced. The gas moved low, and it killed at night. It affected both humans and animals. It was invisible, and afterward, the cause was not obvious to the people who found the dead. That matters because it gives us a real physical category for sudden nighttime death. The claim is not that Egypt was identical to Lake Nyos. The claim is that the mechanism exists. A gas release can kill suddenly. It can move close to the ground. It can kill sleeping people and animals. It can affect some locations more severely than others depending on elevation, architecture, airflow, and exposure. Now we have to address the difficult part here because just because the mechanism exists doesn't mean that it fully makes sense for what we're building here. Gas does not know who the firstborn is. So the scientific model cannot claim that the gas itself selected the birth order. The explanation has to involve exposure and social pattern. The firstborn in Egyptian households represented inheritance, family succession, and the future of the household. In some household arrangements, firstborn sons may have occupied particular sleeping spaces connected to status or inheritance. If those spaces were lower or more enclosed and less ventilated, then they could be more vulnerable to a low-lying gas event. At the same time, Israel is described as awake, gathered, dressed, and eating the Passover. That matters because a low-lying gas event is most dangerous to people who are asleep, low to the ground, enclosed, and unaware. A people awake, prepared, and physically positioned differently would not have the same exposure. So the model of a low-lying gas event gives us a structure for what could have happened that could have caused a sudden death at night, and household exposure patterns could explain why the firstborn, the heirs, the future of Egypt were especially struck. Science explains the mechanism. The biblical text explains the meaning. Now, again, we are not devoiding the situation of God. We are not trying to remove God out of the equation. So, divine intervention with naturalistic mechanisms makes sense. Pharaoh had attacked Israel's sons. Now Egypt's sons were struck. Pharaoh had threatened Israel's future. Now Egypt's future is shaken. The theology is not replacing the science. The theology is interpreting the event. Now we move to the sea crossing. This is the place where the biblical text itself gives us the clearest natural mechanism. Exodus says that the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. That's very specific. All night, using wind, direction, duration, water movement, exposed ground, and then water returning. The Hebrew phrase is Yam Suph, often understood as sea of reeds. That matters because reeds point us toward shallow water environments, marshes, lakes, lagoons, wetlands, and reed-filled bodies of water. That means the crossing does not have to be located in the deepest part of the modern Red Sea. The better scientific setting is a shallow water system connected to the eastern delta or the lakes and wetlands of the region. Ancient geography matters here because the delta has changed. Waterways have shifted. Lakes have disappeared or changed shape. The modern map does not perfectly preserve the ancient landscape. So when we hear Sea of Reeds, we should think in terms of a shallow, reed-filled body of water where wind could have a major effect. The mechanism is wind setdown. Wind setdown happens when strong, sustained winds push water away from one area of a shallow body of water and piles it elsewhere. If the water is shallow enough and the wind is strong enough and the wind blows long enough, land that is usually underwater can be exposed. When the wind stops or shifts, the water returns. That fits the Exodus description pretty closely. A strong east wind blows all night. The water is driven back. Ground is exposed. Israel crosses. Egypt follows. Then the water returns. That's a real hydrodynamic mechanism. Now add the practical military detail. Israel is traveling on foot. An exposed lakebed or marsh path can be muddy, wet, and uneven, but people on foot have an easier time crossing it. Egypt is pursuing with chariots. Chariots need firm ground. Wet, exposed lakebed is bad terrain for chariots. Wheels sink, axles drag, horses struggle, movement slows. A military advantage becomes a liability very quickly. That explains why the same terrain can function two different ways. For Israel, it's a path. For Egypt, it's a trap. Then the water returns. That's the science of the crossing. God uses wind, God uses shallow water, terrain, timing. The miracle is not that there's no mechanism. Again, we're not talking about a God that stepped in, stopped the natural world, and then acted. No, The miracle is that the mechanism happens at a decisive moment. Israel's trapped. The winds blow. The water moves. The path opens. Israel crosses. Egypt enters. The chariots fail and the water returns. The mechanism serves the deliverance. When you put the whole model together, the scientific reconstruction is clear. A Nile disruption begins an ecological cascade. The fish die because the water becomes unlivable. The frogs flee because they can escape the water. The dead fish and frogs create sanitation collapse. Insects multiply in the conditions created by rot and contamination. Insects help spread disease. Livestock dies, boils break out, and then a volcanic atmospheric event explains hail, fire, falling material, crop damage, locust conditions, and felt darkness. A low-lying gas event gives a natural category for sudden nighttime death. Wind setdown explains how a shallow, reed-filled body of water could be driven back long enough for Israel to cross. And it's worth stating that several points here coincide with real geographic and historical evidence. That's the scientific model. And the anchors matter. Avaris gives us Semitic presence in the Eastern Delta. Sinai inscriptions give us Semitic labor in Egyptian-controlled regions. The Ahmose Tempest Stela gives us Egyptian memory of storm, darkness, destruction, and disorder. Santorini gives us a major volcanic atmospheric mechanism. Lake Nyos gives us a modern example of sudden death by low-lying gas. Yam Suph gives us a shallow reed water setting. Wind setdown gives us a physical mechanism for water movement. Now, none of these pieces by itself proves every detail of the Exodus, but together, they show that the story has a coherent physical framework. The mechanisms are real, the sequence makes sense, the geography matters, the natural anchors fit the kinds of events that Exodus describes, and the theology is straightforward. God made nature, so God can use nature. He can use water chemistry, ecological collapse, animal behavior, insects as disease carriers, atmospheric disturbances, ash, gas, wind, hydrodynamics, the physical world. That's the point. The Exodus is not less miraculous because God used nature. It's the story of creation obeying the Creator, not nature instead of God, nature under God, not mechanism replacing miracle, mechanism serving miracle, not science replacing theology. Science describes the means, theology describes the meaning. The Exodus is the story of God using the real world to set real slaves free. Again, if this blessed you, if you would share this with someone and subscribe, it would be greatly appreciated. Until next time, God bless.